Hello, this is Radical Feminist Perspectives. This is a women-only webinar. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. Enjoy. So today we're very lucky to have Melissa. Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. I thought I'd turned the sound down. Apologies, everybody. Let me get rid of it. Right, so today we've got Melissa Farley, who's going to talk about Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. So please start, Melissa. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dorothy. Would you run we have a 15-minute video introduction with Judith Herman. So we're going to start with that.
Yeah,
please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Judith Herman, thank you so much for dropping by this discussion about your book, Trauma and Recovery. It was a sensation.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Trauma and Recovery was a sensation when it was released in 1992, and it continues to be so important 32 years later now. It validated the experience of survivors of human-inflicted chronic trauma and changed the practices of so many therapists, including me. Along with the women's liberation movement, I think that your book elevated women's experiences of men's sexual and domestic violence against them to the same level of respect offered to combat veterans, Holocaust survivors, and prisoners of war. If you agree that it did this elevation of the importance and the horror of men's violence against women, could you tell us a bit about what you've observed over the years of the impact of the book, please?
Well, it certainly was my purpose in writing the book to elevate, as you say, the traumas of women in quote unquote private life to the same status, if you will, of the traumas of criminal violence in the public sphere, in war and dictatorship. And enslavement. I began it with a quote from Salman Rushdie that I thought really captured that. From his book Shame, he said, basically it was longer than what I'm representing, but he said, I thought before I began I was going to tell a very masculine tale of war and violence and that sort of thing. And he said, then the women sort of snuck in from the periphery and insisted on telling their own comedies and histories and tragedies. And then he ended up saying, repression is a seamless garment. And the countries that insist on power over others in the public sphere are going to insist on it in the private sphere as well. So it turns out my men's story and my women's story are the same story after all. And I thought that that was a beautiful way to sum that up.
Yeah, and what's been the response? I mean, has there been a difference in the response in 1992 as opposed to over the years? What has been the response to this elevation of the status of sexual violence against women? I mean, could you
Well,
summarize that?
I don't think it's particularly a response to my book. I think it's a response to the women's movement. And one of the big arguments of my book is that you're not allowed to talk about trauma unless you have a social justice movement behind you. I mean, war trauma, by the way, was not given respect until there was an anti-war movement.
Mm.
The men, by the way, with PTSD from combat, still are afraid to seek treatment because, people will think they're pussies, that they're cowards, that they're malingering, that they're, a real man should, just tough it out. And so they were, and shame prevents them from seeking treatment still. So the argument was that until you have a movement that challenges the glorification of war or challenges the subordination of women, the combat veterans, if you will, whether it's the sex war or national war or international war, are going to be shamed and isolated.
I mean, you really could, what you did in that book was to bring the women's liberation movement into mainstream mental health of the day. Wouldn't you say that? I mean, no one did that.
That was the goal. That was the goal. And when we started the Victims of Violence program in the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital, which was the Harvard public sector teaching hospital, we were invited to basically by the City Council of Cambridge. They appropriated the princely sum of $6,000 to start mental health services for crime victims. And the first person we hired was Janet Yassin, who was one of the founders of Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, because the knowledge about trauma was in the grassroots women's movement, and the Department of Psychiatry in a major teaching hospital was utterly clueless.
What a move that was to bring that into that, to bring the women's movement into the bastion of traditional, may I say, sexist psychiatry of the day. Thank you.
To give credit to the department that housed me, I think because the leadership was all male, as was the usual for the time. But they were willing to have a couple of females that seemed to have some moxie, and I think, and partly because Cambridge Hospital, because it was a public sector hospital, attracted people with a social justice vision, wanted to do community mental health and wanted to take care of the patients that nobody wanted to take care of. And so they were willing to give us a home base. And I think that's probably the only place in the Harvard system that we could have found a home.
Well, I'm glad you did. Something I appreciated so much in your book was the way you described consciousness raising groups as which was what I think you and I grew up with as young adults in 1970s feminism.
Yes.
You described the consciousness raising groups as a place for I think I'm saying this right, a place for the gathering of empirical evidence about women's lives. And Can you talk about how those consciousness raising groups affected your thinking and writing this book?
Oh, I think they totally were the foundation. My consciousness raising group, Bread and Roses Collective Number 9. I joined it just a few months before I began my psychiatric residency. And even though our group was a bunch of Cliffies, upper middle class, white, privileged, highly educated women, but even in that demographic, there was quite a bit of things we didn't have words for then: stalking, sexual harassment, intimate partner violence. And so when I began my residency, and my very first 2 patients were women who'd made suicide attempts, both of whom turned out to have incest histories, I got it. You know, I could see the connection between their, I wrote, I think in my journal, the incestuous father claims the same rights over his daughter's body that the feudal lord claimed over his serfs, the peasants, and in the you know, the jus primae noctis, the right of the first night. By the way, I just saw my friend and classmate Kathy Sarachild, who coined the term consciousness raising and described it as an empirical method. And she came out of the Freedom Summer, out of the civil rights movement, and had organized freedom schools in Mississippi, and the bringing people together to talk about the realities of their lives, which they never dared to talk about, was the sort of a foundational organizing method that she learned there.
We used her template for consciousness raising groups in ours. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Again, Kathy Sarachild for important stuff. And we did come out of the civil rights, the US civil rights movement, many of us in the 1970s. Well, I have such appreciation for this book. I don't know if you have the time to talk about this very specific issue of trauma-informed services. Do you have a couple more moments, or?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll make that the last question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm afraid trauma-informed has now become a buzzword, along with evidence-based and data-driven.
Yes.
It's business speak, it turns out. It has nothing to do with actual the actual in-depth understanding of trauma. I think it's just another box that people check now to claim that they're trauma informed, and you know, they as though, I mean, for most, maybe if you have a minor auto accident where nobody was injured, but now you're afraid of driving, maybe a few sessions of EMDR or CBT might fix that, you know. But for most interpersonal trauma, it's not a quick fix, and it involves building a relationship with a therapist and really understanding the whole context of abuses of power in which trauma occurs. And I think most trauma training, unfortunately, is still very weak in that department.
Thank you for mentioning that. And there are many of us out there who recommend the positioning of trauma therapy in a feminist political context, as you so eloquently wrote about in Trauma and Recovery. And we are encouraging agencies to use your longer term model of safety and remembering and reconnecting, which is a template for how women and other trauma survivors heal from the kind of horrors that we all know about too well. Thank you so much, Judith, for dropping by and saying these few words.
Well, my pleasure.
I really appreciate it. And now I'm going to go on to talk about your book for a half hour or so. So thank you. All right. Shall I jump in now? Techies?
Yes, please, Melissa.
Okay. So yes, Judith Herman uploaded everything she learned from the women's liberation movement of the 70s and 80s, and she brought it to the field of mental health. Her analysis of the psychological trauma is rooted in her understanding of what she called the combat neurosis of the sex war. She notes early in the book that the most common post-traumatic stress disorders are not of men in war, but of women in civilian life. I just want to say, starting out here, that in every social justice movement, those of us in the movement are trauma survivors, and we're also working with other trauma survivors. What Herman did was she changed how many of us practice therapy. But much of what she wrote applies to male domination and female subordination. It's not only relevant for therapists and their clients, but to all feminists. I'm going to talk today about PTSD, complex PTSD, a concept that she created and put together, coercive control, and how Herman's masterpiece applies to social justice movements, including the political struggle that Women's Declaration International is currently engaged in. The symptoms of psychological distress of traumatized people simultaneously call attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret, and at the same time deflect attention away from it. This is apparent in the way that traumatized people alternate between feeling numb and reliving the event. This dialectic of trauma, as Herman called it, gives rise to the complicated, even uncanny alterations of consciousness that Orwell called doublethink and mental health professionals call dissociation. So could I have the first slide, you all? And that's my email. Feel free to write me if you would like. And then let's go to the next one. Oops. Describing symptoms of traumatic stress, Herman wrote, "The most powerful determinant of psychological harm is the character of the traumatic event itself. Individual personality characteristics count for very little in the face of overwhelming events. There's a simple, direct relationship between the severity of the trauma and its psychological impact. This is such a powerful statement of fact, and it's powerfully healing to survivors of trauma, because what it says is, you're not crazy. You're a survivor of atrocities, and we're naming the atrocities as the cause of your distress, not your personality or your defects of character. That alone would be enough to make me grateful to Herman for the rest of my life. But I just want you to know it's a big deal. And as I talk about this book, it's tempting just to quote her again and again, because if you haven't read or reread that book in the last 5 years or so, the eloquence and the simplicity of the writing is something else again. So she writes that trauma is an affliction of the powerless. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. She comments that disasters are caused by nature, but atrocity is caused by humans. Now, today, I want to say that those two things are combined. Before we started today, people were talking about the temperature on the East Coast of the US, which is extremely high, extremely abnormal. And today, we can't so easily separate disasters caused by nature and atrocity caused by humans, because when it comes to the climate, they're intertwined, as we're starting to learn. Traumatic reactions happen when resistance and escape are not possible. The result is a fragmentation and disorganization of responses to threat. Traumatized people feel and act as if their nervous systems have been disconnected from the present. Chronic trauma is different from a single traumatic event, as she mentioned in her little introductory comments. With chronic trauma, there's a sense of being irrevocably changed, even not having a self. The difference between a single versus a continuous series of traumatic events is the difference between a person who says after a traumatic event, I'm now a different person, compared to the more severely harmed survivor's statement, I am not a person. The symptoms of complex PTSD are similar but more enduring and extreme than PTSD. Complex PTSD symptoms are most likely when the survivor has been an active participant in the atrocity, as happens in prostitution. For example, when she seems to make the choice, that's not really a choice, to prostitute so she can have food or pay the rent. Complex PTSD symptoms also occur in battering relationships, where she stays in a violent relationship because she doesn't have money or resources if she leaves. These symptoms also occur when a combat soldier is an active participant in the atrocity of murdering another person. Okay, now could we have that slide that was up? Thank you. Both PTSD and complex PTSD have symptoms of autonomic nervous system hyperarousal. Trauma causes almost a reconditioning of the nervous system. The survivor is constantly on alert with a baseline of very high anxiety. Intrusive memories and flashbacks, it's like the memory is fixated at the moment of trauma, and reenactment happens. For example, a child repeating the sexual trauma that was filmed in pornography, or an adult risk taker like someone who's been a combat medic taking a job as an ambulance driver. And also the third element of both PTSD and complex PTSD is emotional constriction and numbness, where you get the rabbit in the glare of the headlights reaction, or a rape victim freezing, the hollow-eyed look of someone who isn't really there, and dissociation. Trauma symptoms oscillate between intrusive flashbacks and nightmares on the one hand, and constriction, numbness, and dissociation on the other. There's a flooding of emotions and then a complete shutdown. These contradictory responses can lead the uninformed to see trauma survivors as crazy or liars or not worthy of paying respect to. And the trauma survivor herself may see herself as crazy and permanently diminished by these kinds of extreme atrocities. Herman wrote that the traumatized person finds herself caught between the extremes of amnesia or reliving the trauma and floods of intense, overwhelming feeling and states of no feeling at all, between irritable, impulsive action and complete inhibition of action. Complex PTSD, on the other hand, is a result of chronic, inescapable traumatic events lasting for at least a month or longer. Treating complex PTSD is different from treating PTSD after a single traumatic event, such as rape. Children and adults exposed to the chronic interpersonal trauma of complex PTSD have additional psychological disturbances. So treatment focuses on treatment for PTSD focuses on processing and detoxifying traumatic events, where with complex PTSD, it's important for the survivor to learn to discriminate between non-threatening everyday events and immediate or substantial threats, especially in relationships. PTSD treatments can be shorter term techniques like EMDR, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, and CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, are helpful when there's a specific trauma. But treatment of chronic trauma is best done in the context of what Herman described as a healing relationship. She explained to hold traumatic reality requires a social connection that affirms and protects the victim and the witness in a common alliance. As of 2022, complex PTSD has been entered into the diagnostic category in the 11th edition of the World Health Organizations. They did something right. International Classification of Disease. Thanks, perfect. That's just the right slide. And so Herman described complex PTSD very differently from what PTSD had always been described as. The chronically traumatized person lived through a history of totalitarian control over a prolonged period. And in complex PTSD, there's a shift in the person's ability to regulate emotions. There's persistent sadness, suicidal thoughts, self-injury. There's a shift in the ability, there's a shift in consciousness itself, which is what we see in dissociative symptoms and in reliving experiences. There's a shift in self-perception following chronic trauma, with a sense of helplessness, shame, guilt, and self-blame, a sense of defilement or stigma, and a sense that the person is different from others in some way. There's also a shift in perception of the perpetrator, including a preoccupation with the perpetrator, and this is for survival reasons. It starts out as something like Stockholm syndrome, but then it gets fixed in kind of sense of a special relationship between the victim and perpetrator or the pimp, and sometimes an acceptance of the belief system or rationalizations of the perpetrator. There's a shift in relations with others in complex PTSD, including isolation and withdrawal, disruption in intimate relationships, persistent distrust in relationships, and repeated failures of self-protection. And finally, with complex PTSD, there's a shift in systems of meaning about the world itself, a loss of faith, and a sense of despair that can be pretty persistent. Traumatic events violate connections with others. Overwhelming and inescapable trauma cause survivors' self-esteem to be assaulted by feelings of humiliation, guilt, and helplessness. Herman has a phenomenal ability in this book to understand the paradoxical and contradictory reality of the chronic trauma survivor. She wrote, "The survivor's intimate relationships are driven by the hunger for protection and care, and are haunted by the fear of abandonment. The same techniques used by torturers are also used to control women and children who are victimized by domestic terrorism, by sexual assault at home, and by prostitution. Violence causes terror and allows a torturer to subordinate his victim. Torturers use unpredictable and extreme violence, capricious and bizarre rules. They don't have to use physical violence. The threat of violence is sufficient to control most of us. In the 1950s, a sociologist named Biederman summarized methods of coercive control and torture that were used by torturers to extract false confessions made by prisoners of war. And we used, could I have the next slide, please? We used Biederman's list to explain how pimps subjugate women in prostitution. Biederman's are the first 8: social isolation, where the victim becomes dependent on the pimp or the torturer; sensory deprivation, which increases the ability to control the victim and frustrates non-compliant activity; deliberately induced exhaustion and physical debilitation weakens the ability to resist; threats to oneself and one's family causes great anxiety and despair; occasional reprieves and indulgences stops the survivor from adjusting to deprivation, and it provides positive reinforcement to compliance. And of course, the torturer or the pimp postures as omnipotent, suggesting that any resistance is futile. And degradation makes the cost of resistance more damaging than capitulation. Degradation reduces the victim to a non-human status. And enforcing capricious rules. I once knew a pimp who told a woman under his control that whenever he said down, just the way you'd speak to a dog, whenever he said down, she had to curl up in a fetal position in a particular spot. There was no reason for that except to get her used to being completely under his control and compliant. And the last three rules are specific to prostitution and were reported in a lot of detail by Harvey Schwartz, Jody Williams, and me in the 2007 book, Prostitution and Trafficking in Nevada, Making the Connections. In prostitution, there's the deliberate creation of dissociated parts of the self who happily and willingly prostitute. There's drugging and forced addiction, a very good way of keeping people under control, and forced pregnancy, which is a way of controlling women because they want, of course, to protect their kids. Because most of the public have not experienced these extreme methods of coercive control, Herman notes that people often make very harsh judgments about those who have survived coercive control, blaming them for being weak or immoral. It's difficult to imagine what it would be like in these situations for most of us. I'm just going to skip a little bit forward. Herman pointed out something that I think is extremely important in the lives of survivors of atrocities, including prostitution. Even beyond these techniques that I just talked about, the ultimate control is put in place when the perpetrator forces the victim to violate her own moral principles and values. This is the most psychologically damaging of the coercive techniques because the victim who has betrayed herself then despises herself. The sense of helplessness and the feeling that one's inner life has been taken over by a perpetrator or pimp causes extreme humiliation. Adult survivors who've escaped from the abusive situation continue sometimes to view themselves with contempt and to take upon themselves the shame and the guilt of the perpetrator. Herman and other torture researchers point out that engaging in sexual practices that are grotesque or disgusting to the victim and being forced to lie or cause another person to be harmed, these are devastating to the victim survivor's sense of self and identity. So, what are the stages of trauma therapy? First of all, establishing safety. And this, as Judith Herman mentioned in her remarks, I agree with her and can't emphasize it enough. These principles of trauma therapy come directly from the battered women's movement of the 1980s. And the stages of trauma therapy are first to establish safety, then to remember and reconstruct the narrative or the story of the trauma, and third, to restore connections between the survivor and her community. So the message here, as in working with battered women, the message is safety, safety, safety first. Counselors sometimes have offered quick fix PTSD treatment to homeless, prostituting women who have no safety. What is wrong with this picture? Everything. Please spend the time getting them into a shelter or long-term housing, not doing EMDR or CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. It's difficult to imagine the level of terror experienced by homeless women. Safety comes first, and that means protection from predators. Could I have the next slide, please? I just want you to have an idea for how you would assess safety. It's not hard. You assess immediate physical safety. Is there housing? Does she have housing, both short-term and long-term? What is her immigration status? Does she have physical injuries, chronic illnesses? Is there substance abuse, substance dependence? Does she have access to social services? Does she have access to non-exploitive social support? In other words, does she have, in the case of prostitution, does she have access to somebody other than the sex worker advocacy groups, which is not non-exploitive social support? Does she have literacy, education, job skills? And probably the most important screening to do of all is, what is her level of awareness of her human rights in the world? Often it's minimal, I'm sad to say. Today, and she mentioned that it's almost a fad. Complex PTSD today is almost a fad diagnosis on social media. It's like a brand or a business model. I want to recommend two books that are incredibly helpful in working with complex trauma survivors. Lisa Najavitz wrote a book called Seeking Safety, which is an outstanding manualized treatment that can be delivered by paraprofessionals, and it treats PTSD and substance abuse at the same time. Those of us who've worked in the trauma field for a while know that you can't ask somebody to get clean and sober if you're not working on the PTSD and complex PTSD caused by the trauma in the first place. And drinking and drugging has everything to do with assuaging the physical and emotional pain caused by the kinds of atrocities we're talking about today. So you have to work on them both at the same time. It's a great book, Seeking Safety. It's out in lots of languages too. And for therapists working with chronic trauma survivors, I really recommend Harvey Schwartz's book, Dialogues with Forgotten Voices, Relational Perspectives on Child Abuse Trauma and the Treatment of Severe Dissociative Disorders. So let me talk for a few minutes about reconnection with the survivor's reconnection with the community. The ability to reconnect depends on public acknowledgement of the traumatic event and also community action. I love that Herman focuses on a political activist approach. Throughout this book, she is looking at trauma in a political context, always, as part of a social justice movement. So examples of this kind of public acknowledgement and community action would be public rituals that include, for example, the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial in Washington, D.C., where each dead soldier is named. It's an acknowledgement of loss and grief about that war. the AIDS quilt project led some of us to make a patchwork quilt acknowledging murdered prostitution survivors, which we carried and displayed at San Francisco City Hall many years ago in the 90s. A great joy when I practiced as a psychologist doing therapy was working with clients to create rituals for healing from sexual assault. This was not private, but only included trusted sisters from her community. One ritual, for example, involved the survivor taking a bath with perfumed oil while her trusted community surrounded the bathtub and threw in rose petals while telling her what they knew of her beauty and her strength. That's one ritual that was created with one's survivor's input and direction. The legal system is another method of community action. Many survivors have found that their healing is helped by participating in social justice movements that oppose rape or that oppose the institution of prostitution. Now, the United States has a very, very adversarial legal system. I was just involved in a Colombian legal case, and I was shocked to find it's not an adversarial legal system in Colombia. Everyone is, prosecutors and defense attorneys are both committed to seeking facts of the case. This is not the way it is in the US. Really the legal system in the United States is a hostile environment for women. Our legal system was designed to provoke, I swear, and Herman writes about this, I think the legal system was designed to provoke traumatic symptoms in women who seek justice. And this legal system, Herman wrote, in the United States was designed to protect men from the superior power of the state. But our system was not designed to protect women and children from the superior power of men. Truer words were never written. Seeking justice in this biased US system can be both a repetition of the trauma and a failure of justice. In a system where the Los Angeles police force routinely labeled the files of cases of dead prostituted women with NHI, that stood for no human involved. How could a prostitution survivor possibly be treated fairly in that system or even be recognized as a trauma survivor? Herman wrote about could we have the next slide, please? Herman wrote about the political and social refusal. Whoops, we can just jump to the next slide. Herman wrote about the social and political refusal to use, see, or know, or oppose organized atrocities. And this is one of her more famous quotes from Trauma and Recovery. It's very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering. There's organized opposition to the truth along these lines from groups who benefit from denial. For example, the false memory syndrome foundation was in full sway when Herman wrote this book. They denied childhood sexual assault. Today, we have the global network of sex work projects who deny violence in prostitution. In fact, as we speak at this moment, a battle against the denial of harm that she's talking about, a battle against the denial of harm, where the UN Special Rapporteur Reem Al-Salam's groundbreaking report on prostitution as violence against women and girls, this remarkable report by the Special Rapporteur is being attacked by pimp states like Brazil, Switzerland, and Mexico, who want to see prostitution mainstreamed as a good enough job for certain women, often those who are young, poor, migrant, and ethnically marginalized. These are counter movements to suppress the information that the women's movement is presenting about male domination and female subordination across so many parts of our culture. Herman was prescient about the social construction of reality. Could we have the next slide, please? She wrote, most women do not in fact recognize the degree of male hostility toward them, preferring to view the relations of the sexes as more benign than they are in fact. I wonder what she was talking about. But does that apply to the political struggle that WDI is engaged in right now? Rape and we can start by understanding that rape and prostitution survivors experience a profound disconnection. We could keep that slide up, please. Rape and prostitution survivors experience a profound disconnection between their own experiences and the social construction of reality. For example, the notion that women provoke rapes or that women say no when they really mean yes. Many people also refuse to see the hatred of women in prostitution and pornography. And many refuse to see the hatred of women that is evident in men's insistence that they actually are women just like us. Some men insist today that they not only act in culturally feminine ways, but they demand that we agree that they actually possess our femaleness, that they are us. What on earth could be more socially and politically hostile than disappearing our unique existence as women by declaring that men who say they're women are identical to biological women? So we have a few minutes. I don't know, you all, if there's some, if somebody could tell me, I haven't seen the chat. Can you tell me if there's a couple questions?
One thing, some women didn't catch the names and authors of the books that you referred to, so maybe you could repeat.
Sure. You know what? I'm gonna write them right now in the chat.
That would be
leave
good. Because I tried to get it down so that we could sort of share it, but I wasn't quick enough.
Can you find another question or something?
Someone's asking if you've got a book as well. I don't I mean, everybody's been very appreciative and sort of sharing their own sort of experiences and views, but not, I can't see a specific.
What I'd like to see
question.
most of all is your observations or something I've left out. I mean, the book, it's 2007, so it's a little old. There's the 2007 book that has that chapter on pimp subordination is called Prostitution and Trafficking in Nevada, Making the Connections. And then there's an earlier book that it needs to be updated. I edited the book and wrote a couple chapters. It's called Prostitution, Trafficking, and Traumatic Stress. And it's got 33 different authors. But again, please read Herman's book. It's really an amazing masterpiece of synchronizing what we learned from the women's movement in the 1980s and how to understand these complicated psychological disturbances that happen when women have atrocities committed against us. So I also want to mention this. Judith Herman was kind enough to write the introduction to the book that I edited in 2003, Prostitution, Trafficking, and Traumatic Stress. It is an amazing chapter called Invisible in Plain Sight. And I recommend, that book is too expensive. You know what publishers do after years. You can probably get used copies of it. Okay, Joe, what did you say? Would I say, or does she say that she's a radical feminist? I don't know the answer to that. I just don't know, Joe. She is a feminist, that is for sure. And as I am, I mean, for sure, she would say she's a feminist. Yes. Oh yeah, Sheila's read it. So yeah, isn't that a great? It's amazing. Joe, you're asking,
Yeah.
do I see myself as a radical feminist? I don't like the adjective. I call myself a feminist because I consider feminism to be the job of making sure that women are equal to men and that we are liberated from male domination of ourselves. And adjectives like liberal feminists, millennial feminists, old-fashioned feminists, they don't, even radical feminists for me, I love the word feminist, so I'm attached to it.
Yeah. That's
anyway.
A great reply. Yes, I think I'd probably say radical feminism is the real feminism, and all the rest are sort of slightly twisting it. That would be my take on it. But yeah, it's the end goal that's important. But anyway, thank you so much, Melissa. That was really, really interesting. I can see from the chat that everybody really appreciated it. And
thank you.
Maybe you could come back another time and share some more of your insights with us. So
thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. And yeah, 5 of us could do 5 different summaries of this remarkable book. So thanks to everyone for the support on the chat. I appreciate that too.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So thank you for watching, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye.